progress. small, intimate space for a conversation, not a kind of a big public lecture where we go to a hall with 1,000 people. We are recording the session. Part of this conversation.
With the quality of the recording. Those who are participating online, later on, there will be an opportunity for them to interact. They will write their questions online. We will read those questions out to those who are here. Those who are online, if you do not hear or do not understand, please put on the comment section. The colleagues at the back who are controlling will see your questions and we will respond to your question. So those are just the logistics. In terms of the bathroom, it's out that door. On your right, there is a sign to the bathroom. I have called the South African Weather Service. There will be no more storm after what we have gone through. So please be calm. We will manage the time to make sure that we finish exactly at 6 o'clock. So we're running this as tight as we can. So let me request the principal of the Tambo School of Leadership, Comrade Makura, to come and open and do the outline before we go to our main speakers, and later on you yourselves will be engaging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Busan Ngaweni, the principal of the National School of Government in South Africa. I want to thank you first because the team that we have today, the delegation from Peking University, led by Professor Wang, are your guests, basically. They are visiting the National School of Government. And in the course of the many interactions they had, they have provided us with an opportunity today to interact with a wider a team of people in the name of the OR Tambo School of Leadership, both here and those who are online. So I really want to thank you, Prof, for having afforded us this opportunity. I also want to acknowledge Kuzeni, the Deputy Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure, who's going to be sharing some thoughts on the economy, and Dr. Neva Makgetla, who is also going to share some thoughts online. We were also going to be joined by Professor Fiona Trigena. We will know soon how we are doing on that front. So my greetings to all of you who are online. Greetings from Emoyeni in Johannesburg. I want to say a few things. The OR Tambo School of Leadership was established 7 years ago in 2018, established with the sole purpose of building leadership and cadreship for progressive social change. Over time, we are going to interact even on this question about progressive social change, what it means, what caliber of people would we want the school to contribute to building, what caliber of leadership, what caliber of professionals across the board. So we are scaling up. Over the period of the existence of the school, 66,000 cadres of the ANC from throughout the country went through the school, completing what's referred to as Introduction to Political Studies. It's 4 basic modules. And that phase of the school, we are scaling up now, we are transitioning to the next level. The school is also supporting the ANC's foundation course, which was launched in November last year. The foundation course is a training program for every member of the ANC who basically, that's a new requirement that every member of the ANC must complete a 5-module course to understand the history of the ANC and the history of South Africa, what the ANC stands for, its vision, but also the constitution of the republic and the system of government in our country, international relations, why we approach the world and the continent the way we do, and also basic issues of organization. So far, we have taken close just under 110,000 ANC members as of today. Just under 110,000, 109,000, a couple of numbers and this is taking place at branch level. But also our caucus members. We have some of the national caucus members online here, I certainly know, who have completed this foundation course. So the next big thing when you have completed the foundation course is what else is the school offering? And this series of policy seminars we are starting today, starting with the economic policy seminar series, is what we want to do every year. In addition to other training programs, the foundation course for all members, the political schools in our regions and in our branches to take people through various themes on leadership, on governance, on economic development. In addition to that, we basically are starting today. So that's precisely what we are launching today, what we call the policy master classes. So those of you who have joined us physically and online, you are very important people. You are the very first master class on the economy. So we look forward to hearing from our speakers. Kuzeni has a lot of experience as the former premier and the minister of public works and infrastructure, and what he's doing now. He's got a lot of experience on you cannot lead a province like KwaZulu-Natal, which is the 2nd largest economy in our country. You can't lead that province without, it's essentially, the big thing there is the economy. So the economy is the #1 priority of the ANC and the #1 priority of the South African government. And that's why we start with the economic policy series. And then the #1 problem we really have as a country. Once we go through, we're going to look at various sectors. We start today. We're going to go sector by sector to look at the different sectors of our economy over a period of time. When we look at the economy, we look at social policy, the various themes and subsectors on social policy, and then we will look at governance. Prof, what you do very well, to look at how we organize the state, including public administration, to achieve what we want to achieve. So I look forward on behalf of the team at the school. We just concluded a meeting with our chairperson, President Kgalema Motlanthe, who met the Chinese delegation. and I'm also conveying this message on his behalf. We look forward to a number of this series of sessions virtually. We will expand that, but also we need this hybrid model of the physical sessions. We also want to make sure that some of these programs we are delivering at the OR Tambo School of Leadership are accredited programs. We are working in partnership with other schools. I just came back this morning from Tanzania. We're working also with Mwalimu Julius Nyerere's Leadership School, which is also offering programs on governance, on development from a Pan-African perspective. We're working with the Central Party School in China as well on questions of leadership, questions of governance, questions of development. We are learning and sharing experiences on how to ensure that we can govern South Africa well and govern South Africa effectively to achieve the vision we have set for ourselves. And that vision for the ANC is extremely important. We will hear a little bit more about that. So I really want to thank you all and welcome you. We look forward to seeing you in the next series of these masterclasses. As I said, we will continue with the economy until we have covered the different sectors. We're going to be inviting different experts, and I want to emphasize progressive economists. Progressive is deliberate. This school was established for that purpose. But we will also be keen to get platforms for that debate to take place, including with those who hold a different view on how we organize the South African economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Principal Makura. So we're going to have two interventions now, and then we're going to have a respondent, Dr. Makgetla, who will respond online. One needs to emphasize that if you look at 400 years history of industrial development, you'll know that development is a function or an outcome of learning. There is no country in the world that is industrialized without learning from another. Neither will the countries in North America, nor the countries in Europe. And those countries that have been able to make leaps are those who've been able to take lessons from others, distill those lessons, and evolve them within their own local conditions. In South Africa today, we've got two Asian additionally, nations who are producing cars that are in the top 10 of the fastest selling cars. And that is India and China. And none of them produced cars 70 years ago. But now, just in this very small market in South Africa, they feature dominantly at least 4 spaces in the top 10 of the fastest selling passenger cars in South Africa is occupied by those. I am not counting South Korea and Japan because they are also there since they started and they were ahead of these two. And the fact that they can produce those cars and sell them in the market here, as small as it is, confirms this idea that development is a function of learning. America learned from what happened in England after the Industrial Revolution, so did Germany and many others. So this is the context within which we must take these type of conversations. We had a Professor Kishore Mabubani recently. He has persistently asked a question, or at least put a proposition that says China succeeds because of government, India succeeds in spite of government. And I add, what about South Africa? And of course, what about the rest of the rest of the world? The social dynamics, the productive forces in each of these countries are not the same. So the idea, therefore, of opening up these opportunities for learning, for influencing each other important, because amongst those who are in this meeting, are those who are part of government. They lead in the GNU and in other structures at different levels, and we hope that this will impact on them and they will be able to use some of these learnings when they make decisions elsewhere. So there is a context. Thank you once again for coming. Comrade Zikalala, Deputy Minister.
Thanks, Prof. Ndaweni. May I take this opportunity to extend my greetings to you, Professor Ndaweni, the principal of the National School of Governance, the principal of OR Tambo School of Leadership, and is a member of the ANC and the head of political education, Comrade David Makura, our guest speaker here, Professor Huang, and the entire team coming from China. We extend warm greetings to all of you from the University of Peking. May I also greet Dr. Neva Makgetla, who is joining us virtually, as well as Comrade Dr. Kremer, who's here with us from ETC. We extend greetings to all of you, the participant at this South Africa's industrial policy dialogue organized by the OR Tambo School of Leadership. And I doubt that we all agree that given the current geopolitical landscape that we face globally, we will all agree that this is an important session. It's an important session because this engagement must be held to learn from each other, but to develop tight relations and to influence economic trade relations as well as solidarity to end conflict in the world and build sustainable and prosperous world order. So history has imposed a responsibility on us to face and defeat regionalism, discrimination, and global economic environment that work for the few and perpetuate imperialism. We believe that today's engagement must help us to learn, but also to learn from our own mistakes. I will therefore emphasize the latter part of what Comrade Makura said. Let us engage, not because we agree. Let us engage even with those we disagree with those who will come with different opinions, so that we will be on our toes, both in terms of thinking to find the best solutions to our economic challenges. China is one of those countries that have succeeded in past decades, and it has undergone rapid industrialization, transforming the country from being a largest society to become a global industrialized powerhouse. It was known as an agrarian society, but it is now reckoned throughout the world as an industrial powerhouse. It has successfully reduced unemployment and managed to extricate people from poverty. And therefore, we look forward to exchange ideas on how they have succeeded in doing so. But coming to a subject matter on industrial policy in South Africa, maybe it will be correct to affirm the injunctions of the Freedom Charter, which was adopted 70 years ago in Kliptown. The Freedom Charter says, when it comes to economy, and I quote, "The people shall share in the country's wealth. The national wealth of our country The heritage of all South Africans shall be restored to the people. The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. All other industry and trade shall be controlled to assist the well-being of the people. All people shall have equal right to trade where they choose, to manufacture, and to enter all trade, crafts, and professions, close quote. So this is what the Freedom Charter said, and this is why we believe that as the African National Congress was still guided by this injunction in the prosecution of the National Democratic Revolution. Since 1994, after ascending to power, the ANC government has introduced a number of economic policies with a different intentions, but all of these have been to ensure that, one, we grow the economy, distribute it, and ensure that the economy is absorbing people in terms of employment. Key among the policies that were put in place is the RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Plan. The second was the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy of 1996, the Accelerated Shared Growth Initiative of South Africa as GISA, the New Economic Growth Path of 2010, the National Development Plan of 2012. These policy interventions have yielded some elements of what we envisaged before. However, they've not managed to successfully restructure the economy. I have taken comfort to mention them because we believe from the ETC that one of key challenges that lead to the failure of economic restructuring is the fact that we have been unable to implement one industrial framework for at least more than 10 years. You will move from gear, and when you are implementing gear, you will then hear of a plan as GISA, then a new the new growth path of 2010, and then you have the industrial plan that we implemented. So we do need to have an overall coordination and understand that this is the industrial framework that we're putting in place, which is futuristic, but addressing all sectors of the economy. Right now, South Africa is facing a long-standing structural crisis of accumulation. Our economy remains reliant on mineral extraction, with mining product accounting for at least 60% of export. Agriculture accounting for 10%, and that tells you that we export mineral raw as they are, which have become a hot discussion for years in the ANC. And therefore, we do need to respond to this, and I will talk to that later. Manufacturing contribution to the GDP has declined from 22.7% in 1994 to 12% in 2024. The gross fixed capital formation is at 14.5%, yet we said as we go to 2030, it should be at 30%. youth unemployment economy, economic growth outlook remain a challenge with GDP growth of 0.7% in 2023 and 0.6% in 2024. There has been a number of initiatives to restructure the economy of our country. At the center of that have been the black-based economic empowerment. It has succeeded to create at least the African. The second has been the Black Industrialist Program, which have seen and yielded positive results in integrating Africans and blacks in the mainstream economy, which is manufacturing. However, we have continued to face serious challenges, the resistance to restructuring of the economy, especially in the two sectors, mining and agriculture. We have failed to move to manufacturing, and we continue to export raw material as it is. We have secondly seen the rise of monopolies becoming oligopolies. One cartel or one monopoly will own a particular industry. With time, will also stretch its influence to other sectors, and you will find one and the same people playing and dominate various sectors. And these are challenges we must face. While Competition Commission has tried to deal with collusion, we continue to see serious resistance in terms of collusion, price fixing, and manipulation of currency. These are challenges that we see that we need to address in the industry. As government in 2012, led by the ANC, because even this current administration, I call it the 7th administration, I don't have a problem with calling it GNU, but I emphasize that this is a 7th administration because government is not created now. We've had government, the democratic government, from 1994, which was the first administration, and government has evolved till now, where we have the 7th administration. From the 5th administration till now, and has focused on establishment of industrial master plans. We've successfully developed the master plans that covers key sectors, and these are retail, clothing, and textile as the first sector, sugar master plan, furniture master plan, poultry, automotive master plan, steel and metal fabrication, medicine devices, global business service. These are 8 master plans that the department under the Department of TIC have managed to develop. But besides developing these master plans, we have been implementing the industrial strategy, focusing on building special economic zones. We've managed to establish operating 13 economic zones in the country. We are also covering areas that were neglected during the apartheid time. We talk now that we should ensure that we have Bukubai special economic zone in Northern Cape. And it would be known that Northern Cape has always been a mining province, but mining for extraction. We are now saying, let us have a special economic zone so that we decentralize the industrial plan throughout South Africa. It is true that once you have the infrastructure in the area, all industries follows. And that's why we are saying let us decentralize these special economic zones. These special economic zones offers a host to domestic and international investors, and these include incentive packages that comes with these special economic zones. We inherited the industrial parks that are in our townships. We continue to revamp these industrial parks, but we want in our strategy to change these industrial parks to accommodate especially SMMEs that come from the nearby areas, to ensure that we provide SMMEs with ease of doing business, especially on issues of input cost, electricity, water, and all that is part of input cost. But overall, we have developed the National Industrial Plan 2025. This is the industrial development plan that is being developed under the leadership of Comrade Parks Tau as the minister and Comrade Zuko Kodlimpi. But I must say, it comes from the African National Congress. It comes from the thinking of ANC. The master plan is anchored on three areas: decarbonization, digitalization, and diversification. Out of this master plan, we have said in the next areas of focus should be the following. One, whole of government coordination. That has been lacking when we talk of economy. The whole of government coordination. This is the plan that we are saying DTIC must oversee. It must run across sectors and across departments. We have always believed that the economic plan rests with Treasury. We believe Treasury plays a critical anchor role, but DTIC need to play this whole of government coordination to enhance industrialization. Secondly, embedded sector solutions. Each sector, we must be able to say these are priorities and this is what is going to be done in the next 3 to 5 years. Future-oriented industries. We must begin to say these are the industries of the future. And this includes a dedicated focus on the energy sector and other emerging sectors in the economy. We're saying through this, we must be able to look on issues of green hydrogen, storage, digital services, electric vehicles, and agro-industrial value chain. So these are key areas that we believe are going to define the future industries. We say the fourth area is mobilization of finance and investment. When we talk about mobilization of finance, we start on what we have. We have IDC, we have the National Empowerment Fund, and we have a number of development institutions nationally and in provinces. These institutions must be channeled not to support areas that are not a priority industrialization. It would be good to bring equipment. It will help us in industrialization. So our strategy on industrialization must be funded. We must not have a situation where funds are channeled in sectors that are of less importance, that continues to maintain the status quo. The fifth area is the alignment of policy instrument, the trade policy, the procurement, the public procurement, the regulations, development together must be aligned and coordinated together. Having said that, we are emphatic also on the coordination of macro and micro interventions. We must ensure that whilst we focus big industries, we don't neglect SMMEs. In this regard, we say SMMEs needs to be supported in terms of finance, but also in terms of non-financial intervention. We believe that the critical areas as we go forward in priority, it's the minerals, which are key instrument in the industrial strategy. Already, Minister Mantashe have launched the critical strategy, which will ensure that we coordinate the interventions when it comes to strategic minerals. All critical minerals need to be consolidated for industrialization than for export. The second, as I automotive, we are working hard on growing the automotive sector in the country. Whether you will talk of BMW in Pretoria, and you will talk of automotive sector in Gqeberha, and you will talk of automotive sector in Durban. Area is that of pharmaceutical, which I have covered. The new area is digital. And therefore, these are the pillars of this NIP 2025 that are now going to 2029. We are expecting that this national industrial plan will ensure that we achieve the 3% annual growth of GDP. Secondly, manufacturing value-added growth of 1% per annum. Thirdly, manufacturing export growing by 4.1%. Thirdly, creation of jobs at an annual of about 100,000 new in the next 5 years. It is because of that that DTIC have conceptualized the Transformation Fund. Transformation Fund will work in the manner that is similar to that of the Black industrialist. It will ensure that we support the transformation in key sectors of the economy. Thirdly or lastly, DTIC has also announced a 12 billion funding approved by IDC to support the Black industrialist, youth, and that this strategy will change the structure of the economy. We must ensure that ours is to fight the status quo so that we have the economy that we the people. Therefore, National Treasury should exercise its executive responsibility and give direction even to the South African Reserve Bank to ensure that it play its role in stimulating economic growth and creation of jobs. This framework of ensuring overall coordination of all economic sectors needs to be adopted from the ANC and the government. I think one China, as I conclude, is that of the National Development Commission. But all us under this whole of government coordination, all sectors of the economy will have to be coordinated from one central point, and we must ensure that we grow the economy faster, in a way address the catastrophe of unemployment and poverty, which we see every day affecting our people. We hope that the current generation will embrace that spirit of the generation that adopted the Freedom Charter. They said, as delegates, these freedoms we will fight for side by side throughout our life until we have liberty. And we must have that commitment that even against the resistance, we will fight for economic transformation of this country. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention, Comrade Deputy Minister. He didn't say he was in Beijing recently on one of our short learning programs organized by the National School of Government. It was a unique one because it had all the GNU parties represented in that group, and they had a fruitful time. The interesting thing, when we as the National School of Government arrange these short learning programs, they are really about learning in the classroom, dealing with core issues. They are not much about going to the Great Wall, although you'll still go there, but they are less so about sightseeing and more about asking fundamental questions, which Prof. Huang will also speak about just now. Thanks for this intervention, Comrade Deputy Minister, because you did both the historical overview, but also linked it with the current moment as to what programs are in place. Now it's time to learn a perspective from China, after which Dr. Makgetla will respond, and then you will engage. Thank you. I'm not introducing speakers. I mean, we'll do that later, but he will introduce himself and the people he's with, just to manage time.
Well, first of all, on behalf of the delegation from Peking University, we represent the Institute of South-South Cooperation. PowerPoint file. Let's get. Yes, can we enlarge it? Move on to the next slide. Going Minister side for an excited for learn. I was asked a bit about in relation to the so I experience a bit. Also hopefully what will be relevant for the global south. My idea that we have been thinking about work with experts from the South Africa, what we call global center. Heard about the Washington created by national organizations like the World Bank, Treasury. They have a list of partners that they think would be important for developing countries. If you're not familiar, you can Google and you find summary Washington consensus basically promote the idea of liberalization, allocate and the pricing of and if you, for instance, look at the specific include liberalization of trade and investment, and exchange rate, and the liberalization of the basic principle or the idea is minimum rules. Therefore, the market outcome of the economy. As an economist, was trained sense, because at the end of if the function efficient, the outcome right. That's some economists. But over time, however, I would argue that more involved in. We start to find that the market often is not perfect, especially in developing countries, in the global south. Then the question is, if we just leave the market alone, will the market be able to deliver the magic? If the market cannot automatically generate magic, what happens? I think the question is then, well, maybe there is some room for coordination or combination between an efficient market and a proactive government. Second, when we say, especially for a country like China, and I think for many other developing countries as well, if you don't have a perfect market system, but you want to move toward it, and I still believe in free market, and I think if the free market works, it will be very good. But we need to make efforts to move toward that market. The second question is, how do we do it? In the early 1990s, because China was a transition economy, we used to have this central planned system. And we decided to move toward a free market system. Our approach was what we call gradualism, or dual track system. You move toward the free market, but step by step. In the former Soviet Union, for instance, you probably heard about the term shock therapy. The idea is that if you are having this central planned system which is not working, and you hope that you move toward a free market system, what is the best strategy of the transition? If you're a mathematician, or if you had a primary school mathematics, your answer probably will be the simplest and the most effective way of the transition is jump from the central planned system to a free market. That's the idea of the shock therapy, which was originally proposed by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, originally from Harvard and at the moment at the Columbia University. That approach did not work, I must say. The main reason is you can't imagine that today you shut down everything about the central planned system and hoping that tomorrow morning when you wake up, there will be a well-functioning market system. Development of a market system in developed countries took a very long time to accomplish. So this is why the gradual approach might be better. Might be better, I'm not saying this is approach without any cost. The gradual approach has many downsides, but it helps you to move gradually toward a market system. And this is why we're hoping that we would be able to propose some policy framework that is relevant for the global south, based on the specific conditions in developing countries. So for instance, we still want to aim at building an efficient market system. Therefore, eventually, allocation and the pricing of the resources will be determined by the market. But in the short term, if the market system is not well functioning, maybe the government should do something to facilitate the operation of the market, not to replace the market. Again, if we are thinking about moving toward a market system, we probably should be more practical. Practical means when you design something, you should make sure it is feasible. What I think is the shock therapy approach was ideal in theory, but was not practical because you can't really jump to a free market system. That's why the practical approach is useful. The final point is growth is very important, but I think increasingly we would recognize that growth is not everything. And I think to some extent, this is what we are seeing in the US. And I think we all would agree the US benefited from globalization significantly. You look at the US GDP per capita today, right? It's higher than many other developed countries. And you look at the economic structure in the US, the financial sector, the innovation, the other high quality value added services, they're all doing fantastically well. This is why the US economy has been advancing very rapidly. But why there was a backfire in terms of the globalization policy during the last 10 years or so, the main reason, in my view, at least one reason, was because inequality problem. When you were moving forward, the whole economy was benefiting, but lots of people were left behind, including the blue-collar workers in the small towns. And that caused problems. So that certainly reminds us, efficiency and growth are important, but at the same time, we should pay attention to employment, jobs, equality. And also, I think financial stability, lots of things that we need to take into account. So this is the basic idea we're trying to propose and to discuss with our counterparties in developing countries, that maybe we should propose a policy framework that is more applicable for developing countries. Again, I should emphasize again, I do not oppose to the principles of the Washington Consensus, because eventually free market is something we should look for. But you can't imagine, you can't just dream that you will have a free market system. That's the bottom line. And in that case, I want also to discuss a little bit about the industrial policy. Industrial policy was a very controversial subject, as you probably know. The Asian economies, which did fantastically well after the Second World War, you probably would agree. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and now China, they're all like moving up very, very rapidly. And I would say they probably are very successful examples of economic development. But during the last several decades, you repeatedly hear criticisms of their economic policy, including industrial policy. You look at the US criticism of Japan's industrial policy, Korea's industrial policy, and then China's industrial policy. So let's move to the next slide. Industrial policy, what is industrial policy? Industrial policy refers to government assistance to business to boost or reshape specific economic activities, especially to firms based on their activity, technology, location, size, or age. In short, industrial policy is what the government is trying to do to promote industrial upgrading, moving up the industrial ladder. That's something why that might be useful, and let me make it clear at the very beginning. Industrial policy does not mean the government create new industries by itself. Industrial policy is what the government does to assist the private sector, the market, to move up. So why we need the government to take some action? Because there could be market failures. For instance, a very simple example, we were meeting with your former president and we were talking about the rules of the government. He immediately mentioned the three things: education, infrastructure, and technology. These things you can rely on the market or the private sector to do on their own. For instance, if you needed to invent a new technology, obviously you need lots of players in it, the universities, research institutions, and even the private sector. If the private sector is happy to do that, you probably still need to some support from the government, therefore to lower the cost and in order to do it. So bottom line, and I want to outline it very clearly at the very beginning, when we think about industrial policy, we should not think industrial policy as the main driver of industrial upgrading, but it is really just to facilitate and maybe smooth the path of industrial upgrading, moving from low value added to high value added. That is very useful because according to my colleague, Professor Justin Lin, who was the founding dean of the ISCAD and also former chief economist of the World Bank, his idea is economic development essentially is a process of industrial upgrading. You move up from one level to the next level. This is how you become successful. China's economic growth has been successful, I think, if we just look at GDP per capita growth rate. Last 45 years, the average GDP growth rate of China achieved close to 9% for 45 years. And I would say that's not an exaggeration if you call it economic miracle, like you achieve close to 9% every year on average for 45 years. That's been very successful. But you look at the industrial structure at the very beginning of the reform, we almost had no industries. Well, if we had industries, those were not in line with the comparative advantage of the Chinese economy. Then we started from very low end, textile, clothing, toys, travel goods, and so on. And then moved up gradually to the electronics, wide goods, and so on. And then gradually also moved on to high-end manufacturing, including the automobiles. Now, the whole economy is moving toward the new sectors like AI, biotech, and so on. So I think you can see the success of economic growth really is underpinned by moving up of the industrial ladder. That's what China did, and that's why I think it is very important. But again, I should also remind you and share with you, China adopted lots of industrial policies. Not all of them have been successful. In fact, a lot of them failed. So it's not actually not easy. It's not like as simple as say, well, the government should adopt some industrial policy and you would be guaranteed a success. It's probably not. If we move to the next slide, in fact, there are always lots of debate about industrial policy. And as I said before, the Asian economies were repeatedly criticized for employing some industrial policies because some people think that's an interference of the market operation. But as I said, maybe there's some room for it. Even at our school, my colleagues debate with each other all the time about the merit of industrial policy. I personally think industrial policy is necessary for developing countries because there are market failure problems. But we should also be very careful about the industrial policy. If you're not careful, it becomes state intervention. And you actually will not lead to industrial upgrade. You probably will lead to decline in efficiency. The dividing line is not easy actually to find. And this is why my view is industrial policy is useful, but the government should be very careful about adopting what kind of industrial policy. If we move to the next slide. So I give you just one example about the EV sector, electronic vehicles. I'm not sure. I guess we don't have the Chinese EVs in South Africa, but that has become a very successful story. Today, China is probably still already the largest industry in the automobile industry. But I can tell you, China joined the WTO at the beginning of the century. When China joined the WTO, there are a couple of several industries that people all worry about. One sector was the automobile industry, because we didn't have a strong automobile industry. By agreeing to join the WTO, the government committed to reduce the tariffs on the automobiles, I think from 100% or 125% down to 25% or even lower. That kind of commitment led many people to worry that we would not have any automobile industries, because the door becomes wide open. Foreign cars will rush into China. There will be no room for the domestic producers. And that's one industry that everybody worried about. But ironically, today, China has been the largest producer of all automobile products, and particularly in the EV sector for many years now. So that is one good example telling us that opening up actually could help you and facilitate innovation, and competition could be useful. But the competition itself just alone might not be sufficient. In fact, in this case, I think industrial policy is also useful. It is useful in the sense that if you leave everything to the individual private enterprises, the difficulties will be very immense to catch up with the leaders, and especially to invent new technology. That becomes very difficult. But look at the EV sector. The government start to think about the EV production from a very early date. I was looking at the policy document, and I must say, I myself was shocked. The first government policy encouraging research and development and the production of EV was released in 1991. I couldn't even believe it. 1991, I myself didn't even have a good idea what automobile industry was about. But I mean, that policy, I would say, probably was not very effective in 1991. But the fact that in 1991, somebody within the government was already thinking about the need to develop an EV sector in the future in the Chinese economy was quite amazing. Long-term vision. This is what we call long-term vision, is important. So the government, you need to think to have a very long-term vision. And then a series of policies, and obviously it became a successful story. So I think this is a result of a number of things, but so far I mentioned two things. Number one is industrial policy, and number two is actually open up. Don't close your market down. That might not give you what you want. If we move to the next slide, then the question is, well, some people say, and especially when I go to the US and go to Europe, many people would say, well, China has this very strong EV sector because of the state subsidy. And this chart is not done created by myself, it's by a group of scholars in the US. And you look at the quantity of amount of the money subsidy per vehicle in China compared with other countries. The simple takeaway was China did subsidize the automobile, the EV sector, but the volume, the amount of the subsidy was not higher than many other countries. For instance, if you look at Norway, US, France, Germany, UK, Sweden, they all subsidized more than the Chinese government. But I think there is a question here, how do you subsidize? And what do you subsidize? My sense about the subsidy is the reason why you need industrial policy and the reason why you need some subsidy at some stage is you want to make sure that the private company can then survive and compete in the international market. When you're starting, the cost must be very high, especially if you have to compete with the traditional cars. And that's why subsidy is useful. But there is a very important point here. You are careful about what specific subsidy policies you design and what amount. I will touch upon on this later also. So there was a subsidy, but the subsidy was like not, as somebody said, that the Chinese EV sector grew entirely because of the state sector, state subsidy. And I'm sure you can all agree, no country can build a competitive large sector simply by state subsidy. In fact, many countries spend lots of money subsidizing specific industries without much success. So how to do it is very important. If we move to the next slides, then you will find design of the subsidy policy is very important. The first principal point, and I think which is important, is industrial policy should not become picking winners game. If the government go out to pick some winners and let them do it, that will not be very helpful. So not to hurt or affect the market competition is very important. If you want some subsidy, the goal is to overcome the technological or market entry barriers. Therefore, some companies can start to operate and grow. So competition should remain, and competition is one of the key sources of efficiency improvement and productivity improvement. The second thing is, which is also important, is there should be a deadline for the subsidy. Otherwise, you heard about the infant industry phenomenon in developing countries. You identify an infant industry, you subsidize it. After 50 years, you still subsidize the industry. That will not work. If you subsidize certain industry and after a while, if it did not work, you should finish. You should exit. If it works, you should also exit. So whichever the case, you should set a deadline when you will stop the subsidy. The Chinese government decided to cease subsidy in 2022. So it's no longer subsidized by the Chinese government. But also very importantly, look at the left chart. The red bar shows companies exiting from the industry. And the blue bar shows the companies entering the industry. And what you find is during the past years, a lot of companies exiting. And I think that just shows market mechanism is still at work. If you cannot compete with others, and if there's a serious overcapacity problem, some companies, you have to exit. But one reason why the companies all exit quickly was because most of the competitive companies in that space, are privately owned. So that means that the government was designing the industrial policy, but most prominent players in that space are privately owned. Market mechanism is still at work. That is very important. And I think that explains why the industry grows very rapidly. Did we have an overcapacity problem? And I should say, I'm saying this in capacity of as an individual scholar. I do think we had some overcapacity problem. But as long as the market is at work, is working, then overcapacity problems can be resolved with some cost, obviously. It would be much, much more difficult if these companies are all state-owned. Then exit becomes much, much tougher. That's why I think it's certainly it's useful. If we move to the next slides. So I think what I'm telling you, just using EV as a small example, is that industrial policy is useful, but if it works, only works, number one, you still follow the basic market principles. You don't try to create a new industry just by the government. The government's role is not a dominant role. The government role is only to facilitate the market functioning, to overcome the market failure, and to overcome market imperfection. Because market failure problems exist everywhere, and market imperfection is probably more common in developing countries. That is why industrial policy is useful. But today, now the US used to criticize China's industrial policy all the time. In fact, during the first term of Trump administration, he launched some trade policies, protectionist policies against China. And one reason was he thought the state intervention and the state subsidy, industrial policy in China. But you look at today what he's doing. He's employing a range of industrial policies for different purposes. I actually think we should carefully look at the functions or the rules that we should rely on industrial policy. For instance, give you an example. The US administration is adopting some industrial policies in the hope that they would be able to bring back some jobs. Is this something that we should rely on industrial policy, or we should actually rely more on domestic income distribution policy? Because this is more about equality problem. It's not about efficiency problem. So you also hear in the US, they were looking at, they're adopting some policy, especially in the previous administration, in the semiconductor space, right? The small yards, high fences policy. The goal was not necessarily to promote the advancement of the US technology or industry, but to prevent China from catching up. That might work, might not work. If you look at the semiconductors, it looks like the efforts actually failed. I actually raise a serious question. If you want to compete with somebody, is industrial policy something that you should rely on? Probably not. So there's also a question now whether or not we should rely on industrial policy to ensure our national security. This is the argument also you often heard in the US. So I think I don't have a clear answer to these questions, but my hunch is that industrial policy is useful, but we should probably limit it to facilitate industrial upgrading. This is very useful. Finally, I would conclude by saying China adopted some industrial policies and some of them succeeded, but not all of them are successful. Let me say it. The Chinese economic success story is not predominantly driven by industrial policy. It's by its reform policy, meaning let the market work, was probably more important than the industrial policy. But the combination of the two were very important because, as I said repeatedly, there are market failure problems. The industrial policy, when they succeed in China, it's because they trying to overcome the market failure. So this is also a key element we like to propose for the Global South consensus, that for many developing countries, we should think carefully about careful combination of an efficient market and a proactive government. Thank you very much.
All right, so thank you very much. Those were the key inputs. We will share the presentation with yourselves, those who are on the Zoom platform. It will be uploaded so they can download it. There will be several other resources that we will share as well. Those who had confirmed that they were attending, they did so through email. Therefore, you are on the mailing list, you'll get additional resources. Now, let's get a rejoinder from Dr. Neva Makgetla. She's been working on industrial policy stuff for over 30 years, now, and she works for TIPS, which is a think tank of DTIC, Trade and Industry Policy Secretariat. They see to the amount of data, and they're doing some of the critique, Comrade Deputy Minister, of some of the previous iterations of industrial policies. Dr. Makgetla, can you hear me? Please do proceed.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Please proceed.
Cool. Yeah, so first I want to say hi to everyone. Some of you I haven't seen since COVID or before, and it's lovely to see you here. And I think that what's interesting, I think this has been a very interesting set of inputs. I was just asked to be discussant, so I'm just going to respond mostly. I think that, what's important for those of us who are working on industrial policy is that, as Stuki said, we've had industrial policy formally since around 2007, but we've actually seen relatively limited change in key aspects of the inherited economy, and we have to ask why. And I do think that it's important to be clear about where our context differs from that of the sort of paradigmatic experience of East Asia that we've just been hearing about, and how that changes how we have to think about economic policy. And, we can define industrial policy to say it has to be about industrial upgrading. But then the question is, how is it relevant to South Africa? So, I think that what is unique about South Africa compared to actually virtually all other upper middle income countries is the specific ways it was shaped under colonialism and apartheid, which had three big impacts I think we can talk about. One impact is, of course, the dispossession of small businesses. So we have much lower levels of self-employment than you find in Asia in particular, but also in Latin America. So in upper middle income countries outside of China, 15 to 20% of the population is self-employed, or employers, that is, they own their own business or farm. In South Africa, the figure is actually more like 5%. In China, it's over 20%. So that right there shows some of the inequalities, and we also have huge inequalities in income and ownership that are associated with that, but also in education. And finally, we're unusually dependent on mining exports. So over half of South Africa's exports come from the mining value chain, that is to say, from mining itself or from the metals and coal refineries, that is to say, Eskom and Sasol. That compares to around 30% for other upper middle income countries outside of China, where it's actually much, much lower. So all of these things mean that core economic problems we have are inequality and joblessness, not low productivity. And that means that it's not clear how an industrial policy, which is focused on just industrial upgrading and particularly developing manufacturing, even if it's possible, will that actually lead to higher employment? Well, the only way it's going to lead to higher employment is if we're able to find much bigger markets, which means, in our case, mostly exports. And that runs into two problems. Firstly, it runs into a range of problems. One of them is we're a relatively small economy domestically, and the inequalities that we have in themselves limit demand for basic necessities where it's easy for us to get into production. Second problem is, of course, that we're competing on overseas markets with countries like China that industrialized 20 years ago, and in the case of Korea and Japan, obviously even earlier. So, when the countries of East Asia were industrializing, they were effectively competing with the global north, and they could compete relatively easily on costs, not just for labor, but also for things like infrastructure and services and inputs. We're now competing with the countries of East Asia, which, where costs are actually relatively low relative to us, and we don't have a simple wage advantage. It's true that the very limited available data suggests that our wages for ordinary workers are about the same as what you find in Asia, although they're much higher for professionals and people at the top of the employment ladder. But we're not competing anymore with, say, the US or Europe, where wages are actually far higher than here. Yeah, and then a final problem that we face is that we're in a region where we are by far the most advanced country in the region. So we're not getting support from our neighbors in terms of infrastructure or investment or technology, which you did have that ability to work with each other in East Asia in different ways, where the more advanced economies became important sources, not just of logistics infrastructure, but also of investment in technology for other countries. You go to Vietnam and the biggest investors actually come from the region. We don't have that opportunity. And then finally, we're unusually dependent on coal, which is becoming a problem in itself. So we're 7 or 8 times as dependent on coal for electricity. We're 7 to 8 times more dependent on coal for electricity because coal supplies over 80% of our total electricity generation, and that's becoming a problem in itself. And now, of course, as latecomers, we're dealing with this issue of the Trump tariffs, which, is a profound shift, I think, for that industrial policy paradigm that was already running into problems. As Professor Yipping said, under the Biden administration, it's now become even worse. In this context, as Snooki said, it is a problem that our government is splintered by functions and by spheres, institutionally, but also in ways that reflect the deep inequalities and the contestation in society. So it's very hard to come up with a unified set of priorities about what should be the outcomes of economic policy. And it doesn't help, those of you who've been in government know that our institutions were set up to maintain the status quo, that is to serve established businesses and relatively well-off communities. And it's very hard to get them to be more responsive to new suppliers, poor people, working class communities, working class organizations, and other organizations that are membership-based and mass-based. These systems are set up to talk to people who already have power, and changing that has proven very difficult despite having a democratic layer on top of those institutions. To take one example, we have a position that says we are neutral between unions and business in most cases, and yet we don't have a position of saying we want workers to be organized. We have a position that says we will enable people to organize if they want to, but it's not government's job to help people like farm workers or domestic workers to become organized. And yet we know that if workers are not organized, there will still be that imbalance in power that was entrenched under apartheid. And what this has led to is that our policies have been very torn between saying, should we be stabilizing and growing existing production and trying to move, as we heard, move up the value chain in terms of, the more established formal sectors that are dominated by generally relatively small numbers of companies where you need high skills and that will never create jobs on a mass scale? Or should we be trying to develop new kinds of production and businesses that can actually generate livelihoods, even if they're not as competitive as we would like, for people who are currently unemployed or having extremely low levels of income? So in effect, so we've ended up with half measures on both sides where we're not actually meeting the needs of established business, as we saw obviously with load shedding. We're very slow to respond to the needs of established business when things go wrong, but we're also not having large scale programs to try and restore an ecosystem for working class communities where they can also find new economic opportunities, where they can meet their needs better, where we can build human and social capital to develop the economy in a more inclusive way. And so we've kind of ended up with, I would argue, the worst of both worlds in that sense. I mean, one way of thinking about this, those of you who know the language, is that our industrial policy has tended to focus on what they call, I'm not scapegoating international migrants, sorry, just so you know, that that in effect what we've done is our industrial policy is explicitly focused primarily on intensive growth, where you grow by raising productivity, but of the employed resources, but that won't do very much to raise productivity to get people into employment who are outside of employment, where you need extensive growth, where you're trying to say we're going to grow by bringing more resources into production rather than just raising the productivity of those that are already in production. And we can see that in the master plans that Suki talked about. Like at TIPS, we did an evaluation of the master plans. If people want to see it, it's on our website. And what I would argue is the master plans were actually set up with a real strong focus on saying, how do we establish a platform to engage with established business in order to maintain growth, especially after some of those platforms were kind of destroyed during the period of state capture. The trouble is that engaging in platforms with established business, it led to a lot of ideas about what we could do to support existing businesses, but we were not really, but it won't generate ideas or resourcing to come up with innovative new products or producers that could add jobs on a mass scale. And we're not getting resourcing for that either. So if you look at the master plans, a lot of it is good ideas for sort of incremental growth in existing industries, which will do what we've done to date since '94, which is that employment grows pretty much at the same rate of growth as the economy. But that doesn't deal with the employment deficit that was created under apartheid. So we're not getting that qualitative shift in employment that would get us to international levels of employment. So just to be clear for our foreign colleagues, in South Africa, 40% of the working age population is employed. The international norm is 60%. So that 20% difference is why we have extremely high unemployment rates, and also contributes to our high levels of joblessness. But also what happened with the master plans is that we've been unable to ensure a whole of government coordination in practice. So what's really actually happened in practice is, the established businesses come to this platform where the DTIC is represented, and they say things like, you really have to do something about load shedding and the cost of electricity. And all the DTIC can do is go to ESCOM and say, please, would you prioritize this? But ESCOM has a lot of other issues on its hands, and we may never get there. And there's no real way to come up with a united government position that says, is this a priority? If it's a priority, how will we ensure that it's implemented? If it's not a priority, we have to go back to business and explain to them they need to come up with other solutions. So I just want to talk a little bit about what I think would help to get to more employment-friendly growth. And I think it would mean we need to have, like I said, it doesn't mean walking away from established business and not supporting them, but it does mean not expecting, saying we have to meet their needs, but as Professor Yipping said, we can't just be all the time telling them what to do. Rather, we have to say, how do we create the conditions in which they can grow, maybe with a few nudges here and there, but not think that we're suddenly going to turn into, a major auto producer or a major producer of other critical modern technologies where we don't have the market support to do that. And I think that we have to say the industries that can create employment and opportunities on a mass scale are services, it's labor-intensive manufacturing, it's agriculture. And the question is, how do we get those things to grow in a way that creates opportunities while meeting the needs of our people on a broader scale? And one of the problems is supporting small business on that scale, which we've never done successfully, is that it requires really different institutions and systems in both the public and private sector that can, that would firstly meet the needs of a lot of decentralized groups, and that would reshape the ecosystem for new producers and products, so that what we have now is institutions in both government and in the private sector that are designed to support relatively large formal enterprises. How do we set up systems that can support much smaller community-based social economy, private producers, any kind of producer where you're creating value added for society and generating some kind of income, in some cases requiring a state subsidy because you're meeting social needs where there's a market failure, because people can't afford to pay. So things like franchising systems, supply chain, support for supply chains from retail, but also, and contracting out, but also social economy enterprises that support small business producers in a variety of ways, public employment schemes that especially support community services and make our social services as well as our infrastructure more labor intensive. And I think that what's critical in that context is the government has to focus more on building social and human capital, as well as infrastructure in working class communities. And I think what is hard is that these things in our context are very innovative and disruptive, and they present huge risks. So we need the systems to manage that risk so that we can mobilize the resourcing we need. Because as those of you, again, if you've been in government, you propose something innovative now, you can't get the funding because it's too risky. So I would argue that coming up with systems that let us manage the risk of innovation is critical. What would help is we need more clarity about our aims, which may mean some hard trade-offs in managing risk. Again, how do we ensure that we're sufficiently responsive to the needs of established business, that they can continue to grow? But how do we also come up with new systems that will develop new kinds of opportunities on a mass scale? Because we simply cannot, because I don't believe our established industry as it stands will ever be able to grow fast enough to overcome the deficits in employment that we inherited. A second thing is, how do we see economic policy as empowering our communities and our people, building collective action and solidarity, and more sustainable and dynamic economies at the local level as well as internationally, not just saying we will deliver to people, but rather that we will empower them. And then finally, I would argue we do need much more focus on fixing education, which remains incredibly unequal, and which means that in the majority of working class communities, people do not have a chance to get the education and skills they need to be, fully participate either as citizens or as people in the economy. And I think that we need to really rethink our policies to say, what would those systems look like if we're really serious about reconstructing the economy the way we promised, when we came to power 30 years ago? Thank you.
And the deputy minister and the principal of the school to please look at those questions, because you may have to respond to those. So Nomdai, please come and moderate here. There will be microphones that will move. I know there are people who have some time pressures, like Dr. Kenneth Creamer, so he made a request at the beginning that if he could make an intervention or ask the the question first. If there is any critique, he is also complicit because he's in the ETC as well, and there will be several others. So we'll give about 20 minutes. Please do ask, limit it to 2 questions or at least 2 minutes your input. Then we'll give an opportunity after that to those who are online. Nomdai.
Thank you so much, Program Director. I'd like to acknowledge the Honorable Deputy Minister, Principal of the Tambo School of Leadership, Comrade David Makura, as well as Prof Huang from Peking University. Thank you so much for welcoming us today and for setting the scene really for the conversation that we're going to have. I'm actually going to ask some of the key panelists that we have to come up to stage because I know we have chairs for them. Oh, okay. Okay. The program director insists that our key respondents speak from where they are seated, and I do think that microphones will be made available to them. But I think as we start with reflecting on the various presentations and conversations that we've had today about the purpose and the role of industrial policy, and as we unpack industrial policy for inclusive growth, I'm reminded of a quote by Thomas Piketty in his book, Capital in the 21st Century. And it says, "The history of the distribution of wealth has always been deeply political, but it cannot be reduced to purely economic mechanisms." And I think what has been explained today are the various economic theories and options that are available to us, whether that is a free market lens approach or a state-led approach. But the various ways in which that is implemented boils down to a series of political economy choices that states make to facilitate an environment for industrialization. And so as we talk about industrial policy, it's important for us to look at how we put together a combination of political economy choices that result in inclusive growth for the average person in a township and in a rural area in South Africa. And I think we've drawn a lot of learnings from colleagues from Peking University. So we are really grateful for that. I think then in starting off this Q&A session, and as Dr. Kenneth Creamer is ready to respond to some of the presentations today, a key thing that perhaps our commentators can comment on is how exactly we navigate some of the issues that were raised by colleagues from TIPS as well as Peking University, in the sense that we have industrial policy options, and I think colleagues from Peking University explained quite well that industrial policy is meant to facilitate an environment for people like you and I to start businesses that are innovative and that are productive. But we also struggle with the challenge in South Africa where we have communities that have suffered the legacy of apartheid. And so the state needs to fill the gap in capacitating our people to go out and start those innovative businesses. And one of the ways in which our colleagues from China did that was leveraging on things like foreign direct investments to facilitate skills transfer to people. And so in looking at the socioeconomic context of our country, Dr. Kenneth Creamer, perhaps it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective how exactly we can perform the balancing act of creating a capacitated private sector to innovate and grow our economy while also opening up our economy to leverage that fiscal gap that we currently are facing today. So I see some colleagues are comfortable with coming forward, so please do feel free to do that as well. Over to you, Dr. Kenneth.
Oh, thank you very much for this opportunity. And congratulations to the organizers, really a masterclass indeed, and a discussion that is very useful. I just have 2 brief comments. The first one is in response to Professor Wang. I think it was an excellent and interesting input, and it made me think quite a lot about the theory of change. What is our theory of change? And you spoke a lot about the reform moment in China when you understood the role of the market and the role of the state. And I think, as Neva Makgetla said, we need to do the same in our own context to understand what is the role of the state and what is the role of the market in changing our society. When we were young, we were told about the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, who said, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or if the cat is white, as long as it is able to catch the mice. And we in South Africa, our cat is not catching the mice. Our cat is not catching the mice. We need to have a theory of how do we catch the mouse. And I think what you've taught us is that we need to think about that very deeply. The state has got a particular role in directing the economy, and the market has got a particular role in being dynamic. So you need direction, especially given the history. Comrade Sihle read the Freedom Charter to us. Our economy is highly unequal. It has got a history of colonialism, exploitation, racial dispossession. The state has to direct the correction of that in its reform process, but it needs to walk a fine line, because if it does it in a way that doesn't have dynamism, then you will not achieve your objectives. So thank you very much. I found that extremely useful, and I hope that we have more masterclass discussion on that. And then my second and last comment is just on Comrade Sihle's input on industrial policy, because he's extremely correct. This is a high priority for this country, that we are able to put in place an industrial policy that can catch mice and that can be effective. And the point that we're making here is that the industrial policy needs to be, we are determined to have one which is alive to the open economy of South Africa, and therefore our ability to be competitive in the global economy. It has to be competitive. And it's difficult because, as you showed us, many firms are opening and many firms are closing at the same time. And that's being driven by competition. And that's hard for South Africans because we want everybody to succeed. And it's sometimes those choices are very difficult. So we talk about a just transition, whether it's in energy, steel, different sectors. How do we make it just for people who are in decline and ensure that there's more growth than there is decline, the net effect? And that is a big challenge for us, because we need to navigate that very carefully. So the industrial policy that Comrade Sihle was talking about is very true. It's globally competitive. It is one that is able to bring a diversification. So we have to move our economy and diversify into new areas. Maybe the Chinese companies can invest in automotive, in solar panels, and many things, and produce for the whole of Africa. Because what China has is that it's very big, and South Africa is not very big, but Africa is very big. And if we can be using this as a platform for being bigger, and being a platform for Africa, and then there's the skills and digitization, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you very much to the speakers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kenneth Creamer, for those inputs. And I think you mentioned something quite important when you think about how we devise a strategy that helps us catch that mice. And I know in the room we have colleagues from the DTIC, particularly Ms Standiwe Msomi, who works in the head of office for the Deputy Minister of the Department of Trade and Industry. And a question perhaps that I can pose to you, Ndutsugo, is when we look at our economy and we look at what opportunities have comparative advantage for us to zoom in on and leverage on, and then use industrial policy as a tool to capacitate either local companies or external companies to become more productive and more competitive. Perhaps take us through some of those key industries that industrial policy in South Africa should be applying to. I think Comrade Sihle also laid it out quite well when he spoke about some of the key economic and industrial plans that we have. But from a more focused perspective, what are some of those key comparative industries that we should be focusing on where we can create that competitiveness?
Thank you very much, and thank you, colleagues, and to the presenters for very thought-provoking inputs. Maybe just to answer that, to latch on to what Professor Kenneth was actually raising as he was leaving, the opportunity that arises, for instance, with digitalization. We are facing, three transitions. We have the energy transition, we have the digital transition, and then we are also facing the global tensions, which are actually forcing us to be thinking differently. And this also goes to the point that Neva was raising, that there's always a conflict between existing industries and the new industries. So if we're thinking about the energy transition, for instance, there are many opportunities in green industrialization. If you look at China, for an example, we had the colleagues from Peking actually earlier at the DTIC, and they were showing us, in fact, how they were able, obviously they were very, very carbon intensive in the beginning, and yet they started to actually build
these new technologies for the energy transition, such that as they were deploying them, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, they already had the advantage of actually producing those key core products that actually are used in those technologies. And that's what has helped them. We are coming in at a late stage, obviously, and now also forced by the global dynamics. So obviously, right now, we are also facing pressures from the EU, for instance, with the carbon border adjustments, which are actually forcing us to actually transition much more quicker. But at the same time, those opportunities require us to make the choices, the industrial policy choices of who do we support? Do we support exist? Already we are spending about 30 billion in subsidizing our auto industry, but we haven't produced our own from that. If you look at the Chinese, for instance, with the auto industry, which they talk about, they were able to now be leaders in the EVs. So you have that dynamic of where are we, but we are also forced to actually respond to the current challenges. Right now, we're faced with 30% tariffs in a few days' time. We then have to also then go back to those conflicting options. Do we protect existing businesses, or do we deploy the limited resources we have into new, businesses? So that's a challenge that we, as government, government is actually facing. Those choices about how do you support new industries, new businesses, but at the same time protecting jobs with the existing businesses. But whilst we're still facing all of these external pressures that are coming, whether it's the global tensions, whether it's the just transition that we are actually having to take it to account. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's quite an important input when you look at that transition as well between states supporting our industries, whether it's through subsidies or other industrial policy measures, and tracking down that through point that I think colleagues from Peking University were talking about when it comes to letting the market as well play a role. But I think as we then go back to some of the developmental challenges that South Africa, I'm not sure, okay, my mic is still working. Colleagues from COSATU, Comrade Dengo Tangela, from your perspective as someone who's had extensive experience in the trade union movement and doing research and policy work there, it's important to contextualize decarbonization, digitalization, and all of the pillars that the DTIC spoke about within the context of the people as well who are involved in the industrialization process. And I think as we talk about industrial policy in South Africa, a big area of contention has been how do we ensure that ordinary workers are integrated into industrial policy in a way that creates employment opportunities and sustainable livelihoods. So what lessons can we draw from the Chinese story of industrialization to ensure that industrialization doesn't only contribute to increasing GDP and the growth statistics, but it also plays a redistributive role for ordinary workers?
All right. Thanks. Oh.
If we can have, okay.
Thanks very much. Please forgive my voice. I defied doctor's instructions. I've got flu, so I might not be planned or communicating properly. So just to answer some of the issues that you've raised, the first issue I want to raise is that industrial policy is always and has been context specific. It emerged in Germany in solving the social question. I mean, in different countries, it seeks to address other things, but in the South African context, it has to deal with South Africa's social needs. That's the first part. It must deal with issues of structural transformation. Thirdly, it must deal with social inequality. So the context in which we're pursuing industrial policy is a totally different context from other contexts. In a sense that South African economy is built around carbon emitting industries. You talk about ArcelorMittal, that is steel. You talk about Sasol, which deals with fertilizer. You look at cement. And now these key strategic sectors of South African economy are facing significant challenges through green protectionism from either EU, either US, Canada, and other economies. So the context becomes more complex than it is. The South African economy is forced to decarbonize, it's forced to rethink the growth strategy, it's forced to look at social and economic infrastructure, in particular, climate resilient social infrastructure. Was the context that today we're first pursuing industrial policy is totally different, like in the 30s and the 40s. We're facing multiple challenges of climate change, which requires mission-oriented strategies to overcome those challenges. Industrial policy becomes a tool to address those. So as I was coming here, I started, we had a critical mineral strategy meeting of COSATU. Last week, we were preoccupied with the green hydrogen industry to look at what solutions does green hydrogen offers us to decarbonize and around which nations we could collaborate. So when we're thinking about that, the efforts that the Chinese are undergoing gave us some hope that we could engage the Chinese around South-South collaboration around these technologies. We possess critical minerals which we want to beneficiate in the South African context. We call upon the Chinese to collaborate with us in terms of technological transfer, skills transfer, so that we could also build some of these value chains as part of the Africa Free Trade Agreement to build productive capacity in the African economy, like the East Asians have done in rebuilding their economies. So my last point I want to make is that, as I said, that industrial policy is always context-specific. I'm as old as industrial policy in South Africa, in a sense that I've been engaging since the start representing trade union movement in industrial policy making. The problem we have, which we must address, is the lack of coordination between macroeconomic policy, industrial and social policies. That coordination, it's not a neutral coordination because macroeconomic policy must be subordinated to the imperatives of industrial development in our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those inputs. I think they are quite critical. And part of that macroeconomic portion of that mix is financing of our industrialization. I mean, yesterday, the DTIC was presenting their budget to, I think, the NCOP and Parliament. And it was cited that a lot of things could be done, but the issue is the funding gap. And as you know, South Africa is currently making, I think, about close to 70% of interest payments if you look at debt to GDP. And so much money is going into paying historical debt that we have with many of the Washington consensus institutions that Prof. Huang spoke about. And so you have competing needs that I think were articulated by comrades from COSATU on how we have a society that is suffering from poverty and inequality, and our country is spending a lot of money on social protection. But how do we create an environment where money can go into industrializing and financing all of the plans of the DTIC? And that's where I want to rope in colleagues, I think, from Peking University. I'm not sure if Prof. Huang could also get a mic, or if colleagues from the university as well could get a mic. And if the crew could assist me. Yes, so I think in particular related to this question, we'd like to learn perhaps from the Chinese on how exactly the financing has been raised to finance and industrialization, because I think many of the challenges that were raised in terms of the social challenges that are faced by South Africa are quite similar to the challenges that the Chinese government was confronting at the start of industrialization, given the fact that societies were fairly agrarian and many rural communities were in need of opportunity. And so in terms of those competing needs, how exactly do you go from ensuring that you can actually finance that industrialization in a sustainable way? Any takers from Peking University?
So first of all, so we have multiple sources of the government revenue. Including first of all the general budget of the central government, that would be the issued debt, the national debt to finance a lot of major projects such as infrastructure in China. But we also have these, for the government consists of both the central and the local government in China. And also a lot of, in practice, a lot of government, the industrial policy was adapted and implemented at the local government level. So the local government level would also share part of the tax revenue together with the central government. That is their major source, but at the same time, they can also finance some of the infrastructure project through these local financing vehicles. That was later on become the major source of the local government debt, which now at the same time, it brings some, the positive side is that it can finance the infrastructure and investment, despite that the local government don't have much fiscal income from tax revenues. But on the other hand, it creates some problem that they may overinvest in some of the project and create a problem for the local government debt. So there is pros and cons, but the local government may also receive the transfers from the central government to the areas where they may poor relative to the national average. So after the 2015 onwards, we have this reform in the budget law that allowed the local government now to issue the local government debt. So they get a much better fiscal stance now onwards. So to conclude, I think the major source of the revenue, source of the financing needs are satisfied by issuing either the central government bond or local government bond. It may also come in from the tax revenue they're collected. Okay, that's my response, quick response for that.
Thank you so much. And I think that also is a learning point for us for our local development strategies and plans, and how truly that financing is important even at a local level. So I think those are inputs as well that we can incorporate. But at this stage, I will open up to the floor for questions to our speakers, panelists, and respondents for the day. If you do have a question, please may you raise your hand, and I think the team will circulate some microphones around. I am noting a hand that side, and we'll start maybe on my left, and then we'll go to my right. Cool. Can we start with the gentleman in green? Oh, okay, perfect. Can I just note everyone on my left? There's 2 questions this side. And how many on this side? Okay, 2. All right. If you could just introduce yourself and ask your question and just state who you're directing it to.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Meli Kaula. I am the chairperson of SASCO Main at Deputy University. And I just have 2 questions. The first one, I was very happy when my premier there, I'm from KZN, and I worked very close with the premier in Children's Parliament days. So I was very happy when the premier spoke about coordination of government departments, as well as Makombote also touched on it. And I think the question that arises, also given the context of our colonial and apartheid legacy, that we struggle with self-employment due to the dispossession of wealth from the majority of our people. And then that begs us to ask the question of where are we in terms of the resources that we have. And one of the biggest investments of government in the past 30 years has been education, particularly in higher education. And the question that then is asked is to say that in respect to industrial development, is there a plan or conversations around curriculum reform that speaks to the needs that are created by the industries that we seek to grow. And I ask this because we know of the special economic zones like Gqeberha as well as in KZN. However, there is a growing need or a growing gap between the output that we have from universities and the work readiness for the zones. That's something that's been spoken about quite substantially. And it feeds into the unemployment question because you have a lot of graduates that don't really are fit for purpose or fit for the work. So I'd like to ask a question maybe to DTI as well as DM around really are there conversations around curriculum reform in higher education and in basic education as well. My second question is with regards to really the central point that professor from the institution in China raised, say that government's role in all of this policy, in this industrial policy, is to facilitate the activity, is not to be at the center of the activity itself. And I think that is great, and it begs to ask the question of what is the plan around energy generation as we face the energy crisis? And I think also the speaker on Microsoft also spoke about the issue of big business asking the question of saying, DTI, can you please speak of the issue of, apologies, please fix the issue of load shedding. Because it's a huge factor in stifling the growth of the economy. And it's a central issue that the government should be prioritizing. Outside of just energy generation, there's also an issue of state-owned entities that are fundamental to the growth of the economy. For an example, the collapse of Transnet, as well as the, in fact, from the eve of today, there was a raid in Prasa, right here in Braamfontein, due to tender fraud to the tune of 18 billion. And that is directly stifling the progress of economic development, because we need that rail to be transporting, be it from Pretoria, the automotive industry, all the way down to Gqeberha, to the harbors and so forth and so forth. So what is the plan in regards to clean governance as well as energy generation, understanding the fact of green transition and carbon footprint and so forth, but we need that energy generation to ensure that we can get to where China is and then transform into a greener economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your question. Next person.
Thank you so much. My name is Nonhlanhla Chiane. I am a CEO of Imbokodo Lifestyle Initiative Investment, as well as a president of ADIN South Africa. I'd like to commend the speakers on their comprehensive and insightful presentation. I'm particularly pleased that the minister highlighted skills development initiative for women, youth, and persons living with disabilities. However, I noticed that early childhood development programs were not mentioned. Could the minister elaborate on the intervention being made to support the development of young children, similar to China's investment? I believe that incorporating valuable skills and mindset development in our education systems from an early age could have a significant impact, enabling us to raise a generation of producers rather than consumers, with results that would speak for themselves. You know, as the gentleman next to me said, you know, what is the output? So if you teach them young, I'm sure the output would be what is expected, and we'll start seeing results. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to check if there are no more questions from the guests on my left. There's one more at the back.
Thank you very much. I'll just have a quick question. My name is Fiso Ngobo. Well, former chairperson of Dr. Mxolisi Machombo's at Wits once upon a time, but yeah, we've been absorbed by the establishments on Sanson Drive, unfortunately. Yeah. Sorry? Is that better? Okay, fantastic. Just to speak to the former premier of KZN, I was happy when he mentioned the sugar master plan, which obviously was gazetted and coordinated under former DTIC Minister Patel. I think the one thing that I want to know, because whatever it is that we do with industrial policy, it has to respond to the social context that we are operating under. And obviously, I think as we all agree that agriculture is where you'll be able to have the greatest impact amongst especially the unskilled labor force. So the sugar industry in South Africa is a 20 billion rand industry. We know that with the tariffs that Trump has decided to impose on us, it's going to be extremely difficult for that specific industry to be able to export its raw sugar. The estimates at the moment, according to the South African Sugar Association, is that we will be losing approximately about 6 billion rand because, or is it 6 billion rands because of that specific sugar tax. So my specific question is, when are we acting to try and counter those specific tariffs that have been imposed? It's clear that the biggest exporter of our raw sugar is the United States. They're not playing ball. What are we going to do? Because at some point, we need to stop feeling sorry for ourselves. And if it means that we need to find alternative markets, why aren't we doing that already, Deputy Minister of Public Works? And maybe President Makomboti, you can also just chip in on this, because this also falls directly into your department within DTIC. I think my biggest question is, when do we start acting? Because we all know what needs to be done, but there's no action after that. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. I'll now move over to my right. I noted a few hands. Okay, I see two. So we'll start with the gentleman in the blazer and then move next.
Good evening. My name is TK Boer from just down the road from here, from Wits School of Governance. Take the prerogative. I think we are assigned two questions to ask. So I'll ask to our guest, Professor Huang. It has to do with, I think it's Justin Lin's big idea of saying China's great strength has been that it did focus on key sectors that had a comparative advantage. But within it, if you go to China's, I think it's 8th five-year plan, within it, it was to say you must grow the amount of engineers you have, grow science and technology. So the idea of EVs linking with the fact that China, in terms of looking at patents, I think it's leading in terms of scientific citations. Now, in South Africa's case, our industrial policy, if you had to give it compared to our GDP, I think is only 0.2. China, South Korea, 2%, and Brazil, 1%. Does that not maybe necessitate the fact, and I know you said we shouldn't pick winners, but we're a small economy, and our issue, which didn't come up, and I was a bit surprised it never came up, is not industrialization South Africa is facing, is de-industrialization, which South Africa is facing. And a classic example is Denel. The America's industrialization was built off the military. We have basically stripped our military of its ability to industrialize. So in this situation, does it really make sense for South Africa to have 8 key sectors, 8 sectors competing with the Chinese, the South Koreans, and the Americans? What would you say is South Africa's possible strategic, in using, I think, your work and Justin Lin's work, what is our exact comparative advantage? And what does that look like in industries? So that's my question to you. And to the former Premier of KZN, I'm a former UKZN alumni, even though I work down here on the road. This has always confused me about the African National Congress. I'm a guest, so I'm allowed to say this, I think. Is you speak about structure, you speak about economic industrialization, but the state doesn't reflect what you are saying. You spoke about national treasury. National treasury is accountants. How does a government which wants to do industrialization hand over the reins of industrialization to accountants? It's never made sense. We have 3, 5, 6, 7, including provincial government SOEs, financial services sector ones. We're not that big. Why has the IDC and DBSA not been amalgamated? And my last one on the issue of saying structure of it is, the future is the continent, but our SEZs don't reflect that. We don't have the ports that compete with the big Chinese containers that are coming in. If you look at where we're supposed to be going, we're not really a footprint. We're a little print in SADC. SADC is collapsing. And it should not be collapsing because we've never really said to our private sector, we want to go with you into the continent. We allow them to go make a mess up in the continent. So what I'm trying to say is the golden triangle, which is missing, which is academia, private sector, and government in industrial policy and economic diplomacy, is non-existent. It's because we don't have a structure. Our ministries don't speak to what we want to do. And I thought that was missing in your discussion. And my key thing is, why have you handed over the reins to Treasury, who are just accountants? Treasury is supposed to look after accounts. Treasury cannot lead economy.
Thank you so much for that powerful input. I'll hand over to the next question.
Good evening. My name is Tato Mukwena. I'm a student at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. I think I'm worried about one thing, and was highlighted by Dr. Neva Makgetla. And she says South Africa doesn't really have clarity on the aims of its industrial policy, and it needs more clarity. And it's very clear when you see that, like, government doesn't know how to organize itself around what to do. Industry also doesn't know how to organize themselves around what government is going to do. So I think, while other inputs are important, I think like having clarity on what it is we're doing is incredibly important for us to move forward. So mine is just that. It's just a comment that, like, I think we should all be worried about the fact that, like, TIPS is saying that it seems like there's no clarity about what we're doing.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions from the guests on my right? Okay, then if not, what we'll do is, I think there were a series of questions asked. I'm going to actually ask all of our panelists, our keynote speakers. Oh, yes, yes. Thank you for reminding me, Program Director. Before we move on to the responses from our speakers, we do have a respondent on the online platform, Mr. Duma Kubule. I believe you also have a question to pose or an input to contribute to the conversation. So if colleagues at the back could please unmute him or maybe show his screen as well, if that's possible. I think he's on mute. Oh, he's left the conversation. Okay. Okay, all right. We'll continue with the program. What we'll do is I will ask all of our speakers to just answer the questions that were posed, as well as integrate that with their closing remarks before we close off the program. But in summary, some of the questions that have come out of this discussion today have been about aligning our curriculum and our education to industrial policy, questions about energy generation and the anchoring of the energy sector to power the industrialization process. I think we've also had a question on ECD and the role that plays as well in industrialization and ensuring human capital. There was a question on agriculture and the sugar tax and the various tariffs that we've seen coming from the United States and how we're addressing that. Key questions about comparative advantage and what sectors we should be looking at to unlock our competitiveness in the global economy, and also our SEZs not reflecting the African continent, especially in an age where we have the African Free Continental Trade Area. How do we leverage those tools? And the last question was, what are we doing? So I will maybe start with colleagues on my left. I'll start with colleagues from the DTIC.
Thanks for calling me a colleague from the DTIC, but I'm an activist also. So I hope Deputy Minister will allow me to also speak as an activist. Just, on the issue, maybe just to start with the issue around industrial financing. And I think there was a question raised about why are we not maybe amalgamating the IDC and the DBSA. We have a bigger problem. We have not recapitalized the IDC since, well, the 50s probably, when we established it. And we are not having a conversation about that. And maybe the conversation about the alignment and the coordination between industrial policy and macroeconomic policy broadly is important. We've been having this conversation to say what role could maybe, for instance, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the DTIC when I say this, but I'm speaking on behalf of both of us with Tango. Would the Reserve Bank play, for instance, in providing an interest-free sort of loan to the IDC, for instance, to recapitalize it, rather than maybe putting it anywhere else, so that we could broaden the base of industrial financing? And especially because both, and the TBSA for that matter, because actually both of them also have a regional mandate. So when you talk about the AfCFTA, one of the constraints there, and someone mentioned something about rail, is that even though there's opportunity that South Africa could benefit because we are the most industrialized economy in the continent, but we are unable to move the goods. We can't move the goods basically to the ports. I know we're doing some work on that in government, but into the continent, because that's where the opportunity is. And that's where the opportunity around diversification is. So the question around what are we doing also to respond to what we are seeing globally, and diversifying our markets and looking into different markets. We need to first look, and we in government talk about a butterfly strategy, where we say the first market we need to look with. South Africa is a small market, it's 60 million people. But if we think about ourselves integrated into the African continent, we are now talking about over 1 billion people in terms of market size. So that changes the whole conversation about what is it that we can produce. Because if we think about producing only for our domestic market, we'll always face the constraints that we're facing. Now, on the issue, for instance, around that was raised on energy, one of the challenges we have, by the way, around our competitiveness is that Eskom tariffs have gone up by over 600% since 2007 and 2022. So as we talk about reindustrialization, we also have to think about the input costs that go into producing things. So that's where Prof was talking about the role of the state to enable the market. What role can we play to actually reduce those administered costs so that we can create a ground for industrialization? And maybe just as a last point to just respond on the sugar issue. Yes, I mean, even before the tariffs, there's a challenge, obviously, we introduced. That's the other challenge about coordination that Ukuzen was talking about. So we had Department of Health in South Africa introducing what we call colloquially the sugar tax, the health protection levy. You introduce a health protection levy, which impacts negatively your sugar industry. At the same time, then you start bleeding jobs in the sugar industry. So we do have that coordination challenge, and then Treasury will introduce the sugar tax. So we do have that code, but now the other issue is looking at diversification, for instance, in the sugar industry. There's opportunity, for instance, in the European Union for us to actually be supplying them with aviation fuel that is coming out of the sugar that we produce. So it's about how do we act with agility. Now we can't theorize about agility because we are now forced by the global dynamics to actually start really diversifying our markets, engaging. We already have existing, for instance, so it's not about just negotiating new trade agreements. We have existing trade agreements that we're not fully utilizing. We've got market access, for instance, in the Gulf region that we have not been doing enough to actually access those. So that's what we need to start acting on, and that's what we are doing. I'll just leave that.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think I would like to turn a bit the debate to the other end, which means that I think South Africa is likely to lose its access through the AGOA, preferential access. So some of my trade unionists have been asking me that what does the South-South cooperation between South Africa or Africa and China mean? Are there no possibilities for China to provide a preferential, non-reciprocal access to the Chinese market for African products? to build our South-South cooperation. The second thing that my colleagues are raising with me whenever I visit some plants, they say, if you read the DEG report, the EU report on competitiveness, which actually shows that there's decline in EU competitiveness due to it being taken over by Chinese technological capabilities. Now, the auto industry in South Africa is facing significant challenges because the German auto industry, which is BMW, Mercedes-Benz, is facing hard competition from the Chinese auto industry. So my colleagues from the National Union of Metal Workers, they asked me, is it not possible for the Chinese to come and set up like the Germans had set up assemblies to avoid job losses in South Africa? We know now it's a fact that the Chinese industry is dominant in the electric vehicle sector, also in the renewable technologies. But as I raised initially, that South Africa possesses close to 80% PGM deposits, which generally are used in some of the renewable industries. Is it not possible also for the Chinese to relocate some of their production closer to the source so that we could beneficiate South African critical minerals for the development of the productive capacity of the South African continent, but also as a counterbalance in the unequal global relations between the North and the South? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will move over to my right and perhaps start with you, Prof. Huang, on your responses to some of the questions. You can feel free to come up and use my microphone.
I will briefly respond to 2 points. First point is industrial policy and industrial upgrading in relation to Professor Justin Ling's theory. Now, I'm not the expert on the new structural economics he's pioneering, but my understanding is it contains at least 2 elements, key elements. Number one is the economy can only do well if it is dependent on comparative advantage. What you can do well and you can keep do it well. That is probably the best. You can't just do well by distorting the structure of the economy. But number 2, his view is that the government may be able to play a role in shaping the dynamic comparative advantage. So give you an example. China used to have lots of labor, and so we were good at labor-intensive manufacturing, gradually moving up. Today, China produces more than half of the AI experts in the world. I don't know if the government had something in mind that they want to train lots of AI experts. Probably not. But the government made a massive investment in education, and the computer scientist was one area that we generated a lot. And then you suddenly find that China has a comparative advantage in AI innovation. So something like education and infrastructure are the things you should just do, regardless. If you can, you should do it because it will give you some result. But what kind of comparative advantage you have and what you can do better, I think the government, I mean, I don't know the details about the South African economy. I certainly can see you have lots of comparative advantage in the mineral industry and also in labor-intensive industries because you have a lot of people, and how to make use of them and turn them into productive force. is something I think industrial policy should do. But even if you look at China, China pointed to what they want to develop, the government. Not everything worked out. In the end, it still is up to the market and the private sector whether it works. So I think this is why I've been repeatedly saying the government should play an important role in facilitating the functioning of the market and the private sector. But the government cannot determine, like, overall, this is the direction to go. If the government is wise, and you might be right most of the time, but we cannot guarantee the government is right every time. I also want to add a point on the China-South African economic cooperation. I think that's a very good point. But I would also get back to you. You said that China should consider to help South Africa, especially we have lots of industries and a comparative advantage and so on. My sense is that actually the ball is in your court, not at our court. The reason is because we already have a massive industrial base, and the Chinese companies are all going overseas. Then the question is, are they going to Southeast Asia or are they going to Africa, South Africa? At the beginning of the reform, China attracted a lot of industries, investors from overseas, not because these investors wanted to help China, but because they came to China and then they find that this is a place where they can prosper. We had a cheap labor. Our government designed some policy, preferential policy, to encourage them to come. And I think you should do the same. If you like the Chinese, the new energy companies to come here, and what kind of infrastructure you have, what kind of skill, talents you have, and also what kind of additional incentive you can offer them, then they will come. Once they come, they will prosper with you together. So I think you should take the initiative to attract the investors from China because they are going overseas anyway.
A very big thank you to Prof. Huang for those closing remarks. I'll ask the Deputy Minister to join us on stage.
No, thanks, and thanks to all colleagues who have commented. Just few issues. Africa. I think Neva was correct. We don't have a big market. We are a country of 62 million. Mostly, the majority of those people are not active economically. And therefore, we have to work to grow the market. Africa is one destination, the key and primary one for us. We have been working on growing relationship with Africa. We're part of the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. We participate in all structures. We are part of the African Development Bank. We participate. We're part of the AfriCIN, the Africa Export and Import Bank. So institutionally, we are there, we have been participating. But when it comes to trade, companies that must go there will be the big companies from South Africa. Those companies have gone there for mining. They are in various parts of what? Of your SADC. The question is whether they are interested in industrializing in Africa, or they will do the same what they do in South Africa. Then that takes you to the last question, the last issue on that. It means the state must help create entrepreneurs who will then go to Africa. That's why we say in a manufacturing space, when you talk of industrialization, black industrialist is an anchor to support African and the Black industrialist financially, skills, and through the market in Africa. But we must go to Africa not as big brothers. We must go to Africa as Africans and engage with them in a respectful way that also is mutual and benefit everyone. So we must dissuade ourselves of this approach. You know, you go, you play with Ghana, you get defeated, but you rate yourself with Brazil and Spain. No, let's just go be Africans in Africa. We have been part of that. We're supporting companies that are going for trade. But secondly, we are promoting small and macro enterprises to go and trade in Africa. In 2021, we hosted the Intra-Africa Trade Fair in KZN. Big, successful. And the whole of Africa was there, about 10 presidents and big companies in auto, in everything. African Development Bank was there, African Bank was there. It sits every 2 years. In 2023, it was in Egypt. The government of South Africa through DTIC supported SMMEs to go and participate in Africa, in the Intra-Africa Trade Fair. They went to Egypt, supported by the government through the department. This year, I think it's in October or September, it is in Algeria, it's in Algiers. Already the government is planning to support people who are in the SMME space to go and participate in the Intra-Africa Trade Fair. So it is not that we are not part. Part of growing the African strategy is to strengthen regional trade. And we are working on strengthening SACU as a SADC regional body. So we are part of the African development. AU, through African Bank, has just launched the digital trade platform. And South Africa is moving also to sign that so that we are part of everything. This digital platform will allow people to trade easily in Africa without the blockages that are there when it comes to export from one country to the other. So we're part of Africa. The view that there is no clarity, no, I will request that we will read this policy brief, especially from TIPSI. I think from the steel industry, the energy industry, and industries of the future. I presented them here, that this is what the government is doing. It is not with the intention of government to be a player in that space, but government will create conducive environment for the business or the private sector to explore those opportunities. Once again, among those who explore those opportunities should be African entrepreneurs, should be Black entrepreneurs. And that's why when you talk about curriculum, entrepreneurship needs to be part of the curriculum from the high school level. Now, I think that's an issue about us and Africa. I agree, Prof, you are correct, I agree. We must engage with China and others. And I think the comrade from COSATU was correct. But I think this issue of the South, the global South consensus must lead us to that. Because you will say, what are you providing? What skills do you have? And I will make a comment that will address the issue of skills. It's fundamental. We are working on it. some of us even believe that even the funding, whether you speak of NFSAS, must be directed to these skills of the industries of the future. I will want to make one example, the living example. One global company invited us. We went to Singapore. We engaged them. We came with them here. They wanted to invest on oil manufacturing product. So they explore, eventually they settled in the SEZ of Richards Bay. We then said, you are now here. What are the skills that you will require? We then said, partner with Ungoya University, Mfolozi TVET, and develop these skills as you start planning to build. I think now they're completing the construction of their company, of their operations. On the other side, we believe students are being trained and all of that, who will then be absorbed in that industry. So a practical alignment is important. This issue of electricity, where DTIC will go out and speak in support of the business and companies, whilst Department of Energy and ESCOM says something else. It forms part of what I said. It is the whole of government coordination. Whole of government coordination, because it is in our interest as South Africa to keep all companies. Companies will come and say in South Africa, the problem is input cost. DTIC goes to relevant department, and relevant department will renege. So we are building that coordination now so that we'll be able to ensure that whatever impact on one sector is examined holistically, but attended to by the government as a whole, not in a separated way. Early child development, I think it is part of the program. We have moved early child development from social development to education. It is now linked with the education system. And according to the reports, I think we are now we're about to reach a universal access to early child development programs in the country. Sugar Master Plan, I think it is important, and I think Makombo to try to respond to. We've been working on the issue of the Sugar Master Plan for years. The first was the question of association itself, whether it is transformative, it transformed the industry, and then we ended up having two bodies, the South African Sugar Association and the SAFTA, South African Farmers the Association. There are two components, and we are working with them. They came into being through the legislation from government. They've been supported in terms of farming equipment to make it easy for them to be productive. I think the Department of Agriculture has been doing well in that regard in the partnership with SAFTA. However, the point of the access to an alternative market, including an alternative market for implications in case AGOA collapse. I think there is a plan already. I don't know how many times this year South African government has been engaging with Chinese. Last week, the deputy president and the principal here, Prof, you were there in China. The Minister of Agriculture was part of that delegation. But it's not only China, it's expanding access to market, Africa, China, Europe. While we move toward the East, we must also ensure we maintain the traditional market that is there. I think the point of global South consensus do need to be discussed, because it is valid that the point that Neva raised, that some of big companies in South Africa are now contesting space with companies from East or from the South, the broad global South. It's valid. And therefore, we should develop protocols that will guide this mutual relationship in the context of the global South. But we should also know that we have platforms like your BRICS, which also should help us to consolidate a global platform of trade. I think those were key areas that were raised. Just the last part, the issue of one operation ukuvuselela, the program of the infrastructure development from Tshwane to Gqeberha, it is still, I think we're still working on it to ensure that we resuscitate the rail from Tshwane to Gqeberha, especially for automobile. So that is work. ISA, Infrastructure South Africa, is coordinating the project preparation in consultation or in partnership with relevant departments. So overall, I think what we are saying is that there should be a strengthened coordination between government, the private sector, and institutions of higher learning. That coordination is quite important. And therefore, the private sector and entrepreneurs must have information about these projects and incentives that are provided. We should not always expect that we will have foreign direct investment. We should also build the capacity to invest in our own economy as the country. I thank you.
Thank you so much to the Deputy Minister and all of our respondents for the day. Can we please give them one more round of applause, ladies and gentlemen? I think as we close this panel discussion, I just want to take us back to how the Deputy Minister opened today's session, quoting the part of the Freedom Charter that says, all the wealth of the land shall be shared with the people. And I think it's important that as we discuss industrial policy, we ask ourselves, what route will get us to realizing that phrase captured in the Freedom Charter? How will we ensure that we build the capacity for each and every single one of us to share in the mineral wealth, in the technological wealth, in the human wealth that is in this country? And if I was just to capture some of the solutions that were presented today, colleagues from the IDC presented the idea of recapitalizing the IDC, looking at the Reserve Bank as a potential source of funding, the re-emphasis on South-to-South cooperation, the more radical view of non-reciprocal access to China that was debated, but that's something that is worth exploring. I think also the discussion about the relocation of production and productive assets closer to our mineral wealth, to the Northern Cape and all of our provinces that has our mineral wealth is important. Growing the market for regional trade and using the trade tools that we have to trade within our African continent is key to this industrial policy that we've been speaking about. And also localizing industrial development and some interesting financing solutions were mentioned by colleagues from Peking University. I think research and development was emphasized in a way that should resonate with all of us, because R&D plays a huge role in sustaining, not only sustaining economic growth, but but helping it grow exponentially. And I'm sure colleagues who have studied economics are familiar with Solo's model of growth and the role that technology plays in that. We can debate it, but it's one of the theories that are out there. And I think in terms of what the state is doing, coordination has been stressed as an important part of facilitating industrialization. And I do hope that all of the stakeholders represented here today, trade unions, our departments, civil society, and young people, let us all play a role in ensuring that we participate in that coordination so that we don't get left behind as we industrialize our economy for inclusive growth. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Nomdai. So as we close, we don't need to produce any detailed summary of the conversation, except that there is a commitment that we will sustain the conversation beyond today. Of course, there has been taking place these discussions, but now it will be in a more coordinated way. So finally, Prof. Huang, as I said to you and the delegation yesterday, the Global South consensus is possible, and it should happen within certain parameters, mutual learning, mutual respect, mutual cooperation, fair and equitable trade. There must be an agreement that it will involve the technology transfer, and that this Global South consensus will be driven by what I call developmental statecraft, which is a counter to what I call hegemonic statecraft, which is practiced by the Global North. But the Global North, if you don't fall into line, they punish you using a variety of matrices of power which they have. And we are aware that there's a debate about South Africa in a parliament of one capital currently. That is what is called hegemonic statecraft. And so the Global South consensus must be based on developmental statecraft. Of course, the Washington consensus wasn't really it wasn't consensual, and there was a lot of imposition. And finally, that this Global South consensus must be driven by the idea of competitive advantage. And currently, our comparative advantage as South Africa and as a region is our minerals. And so what then do you do is by dealing with what has been raised earlier on, that this consensus must also involve agreeing that there will be a gradual reduction of minerals that will be exported without them being processed at whatever level in these industries. This will give a fighting chance to African economies. And so this global South consensus will be more than just a counter to the Washington consensus. And I have argued that it is possible because there are already some firm foundations for it. BRICS is one example where the Global South is engaging, despite all the contradiction that may exist amongst countries in the BRICS, but it has been sustained for over 15 years. They are able to meticulously manage those contradictions. There may be contradictions between India and China, but in the BRICS platform, there's broadly consensus on what needs to be done to take the Global South forward. So those are some of the basis for it, including the work happening in the ASEAN. And because we must bring in the Middle East, the GCC, and the work that is happening, we recently had a GCC plus China, taking place. All of those could be used as foundations then for building this Global South consensus. And finally, I think the key takeaway from this, it's been stated directly and indirectly, which is a frontier for South Africa, is that we must invest in the rebuilding of institutions and the reskilling of politicians. Reskill the politicians to effectively make decisions from industrial policy, and in particular, what is happening at a local government level. In the work done, in the work being done by people like Davesh Kapoor and others, some Indian economists, who are comparing why India is beginning to power its productive forces now, they attribute it to the reform of local government institution, and that the metric of measurement has changed in India, as much as it has been the case in China for over 40 years, that local government is not just measured on its ability to provide basic services, but is measured on its ability to grow the economy at a local level. And that is a game changer. And their argument, as we read from Vivek Chiba, who's been critiquing India's industrial policy for the past 40 years, saying that Indian institutions are locked in place. That is a crisis facing South Africa, that especially at a local government level, our institutions are locked in place. And the main takeaway from this is to drive industrial policy substantively. We have to unlock our institution and get them to work and work more effectively. So thank you very much once again for being here. We hope we found this to be useful. We know it's been a long day, but it is necessary. We are engaged in a revolution after all. We can't be complaining about being tired. So the comrade Makura, who convened this, comrade Deputy Minister, who gracefully agreed to come, the professor and the guys from Peking and everybody else who was here and those who were joining online, Siabong. If France can come and send us home. Oh, and also to the former president, Mutlande, and who's the chair of the Tambo School. We're also thanking him. He was joining and participating online. Thank you.
I just need to say who is France, so that you know who is sending you home. So he is the COO of the OR Tambo School of Leadership, basically the deputy principal of the school.
Thank you, Comrade David. My role is very simple today because all I want to do is to thank you. And the second part, I'm offering to feed you. But in thanking you, I think just to make sure that I follow there's somebody who gave me instruction to say this is who you thank. I'm going to start with the two guest speakers we've got. The Deputy Minister, Comrade Sihle Zikalala, siyabonga. Maybe I can also say Comrade Professor Huang Yipping. We are also very thankful. But I also want to thank the delegation that you brought. It's a distinguished group. I've read some of their CVs. In fact, I'm jealous that we are keen in future sessions to get to hear whatever research work that they're doing and get their inputs. We also want to thank you and thank you very much. I want to also thank Dr. Neva Makgetla. I don't know if she's still online, but she had to leave earlier. I also know that there are colleagues from TIPS, the organization that she participates in, who have supported this program, most of them online. There are many other people I'd like to thank, and I'm not going to get to thank them individually. One, the ANC Economic Transformation team. Of course, Comrade Sihle is the Deputy Chairperson. And then, of course, there's the technical team here, and our moderator is part of the EC team, ETC. We want to thank members of the ANC Women's League, members of the Youth League, and in particular structures from one of the local universities here, Wits University, and the many substructures that are there. We just want to thank you for that. In fact, Wits is my alma mater, so I just want to say, Wits, great. Viva, viva Wits, yes. But I also want to be biased and acknowledge some academics here, and I think Comrade TK Bowe is an academic from Wits, and there's a couple of other academics I've also been asked to acknowledge. Dr. Mjwanti, And of course, we'll also acknowledge Professor Kenneth Creamer in his absence. There are those people who participated online. In fact, it's quite a number. We had close to about 84 people participating online. 60 is still there. So we want to thank you. And people that are here today, we've got close to about 80 people in the room. And we hope that this is a sign of the future that we're going towards. Of course, we're saying that this is the first step in a process. So our masterclass series is going to continue. I want to give you comfort that the discussion around the industrial policy has not ended. If anything, we're just giving you a teaser. As we think through this thing, we might actually have a follow-up discussion on industrial policy. But on the economy, there will be other aspects we're going to discuss. For instance, the monetary policy, for instance, the fiscal policy, for instance, the issues around international trade and tariffs and all of those types of questions. So we invite you to continue to partner with us, and we hope that you've left your details, both your telephone number and your email address, because what we want to do is for you to be part of the school as we shape the future going forward. And to the delegation from China, I want to say this. We are keen as a school to enter into a partnership with Peking University. Maybe there's a detailed framework we can work through outside of this. So we could do an MOU, but we could come up with practical ways in which we could then make that partnership be of value to students in China, but also be of value to some of our beneficiaries and our students here in South Africa. There are many inputs that came through online, and there are questions that came through online that we were not able to service. What we are making a commitment to you, those that gave those inputs and questions, that they will be collated, and the insights derived from that will shape some of the future discussions we're going to have. We envisage inviting some of you into a set of closed sessions, what we might call a reference group, to shape how we're going to govern the master classes, particularly around the economy really going forward. But other than that, I just wanted to say, I'm offering to feed you. So there are two rooms as we go out here. The door in front of us, that's where most of us are going to be. And then the Chinese delegation, and the minister and the deputy minister, where we were before we came here, we will accommodate you in there. So our offer is very humble, and please don't judge us because of that, but we've made something very small, and it's a token of our appreciation. Siyabonga, thank you, and have a great evening.
All right, thank you very much. Can the Professor Huang and Deputy Minister and the panelists go there, and the principal should take a group photo, please. Yeah, please. Kosatu, please. Thank you, colleague. Please drive safely home. Yeah.